Bernie Madoff's lies exposed.
He was our friend for many years.
The shocking truth behind the scandal. It was the biggest financial fraud in history. $65 billion. Gone without a trace. The mastermind? A man who seemed untouchable. This is the story of how Bernie Madoff fooled the world. White-collar criminals don't steal with guns. They steal with trust. Unlike small-time crooks, looking for a quick payday, they play the long game, using psychology, persuasion, and charm to amass fortunes beyond belief. And today, we live in a world where image is everything, making it the perfect playground for con artists. These imposters don't just want money, they want control. They want to be admired, untouchable. For them, the thrill of the game matters more than the prize itself. So, is money really what drives swindlers? Or is it something much deeper? In this episode, we uncover how Bernie Madoff built his empire, how it all came crashing down, and the devastating impact it left behind. Who was Bernie Madoff? April 29th, 1938, Queens, New York. A baby boy is born into a struggling immigrant family. His name? Bernard Lawrence Madoff. His father, Ralph, had already tasted failure in finance after years as a plumber. His mother, Sylvia, ran a small security business until the SEC shut it down. Money problems ran deep in the Madoff family. But young Bernie, he wasn't chasing wealth, not yet. Back then, his world revolved around two things: swimming and a girl named Ruth Alpern. After high school, Bernie left Queens for the University of Alabama, then transferred to Hofstra, earning a degree in political science. Law school? That didn't last. He dropped out after a year, and in 1960, Bernie Madoff was already making his first move, with just $5,000 from his work as a lifeguard and another $50,000 loan from his in-law, Saul Alpern. He launched his investment firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, a small-time operation at first. But Madoff wasn't just another Wall Street trader. He understood something most didn't. The illusion of security was more powerful than the truth. With the help of his father-in-law, a retired CPA, his firm took off. His secret weapon? Trust. Clients swore by his too-good-to-be-true returns, 10% annually, year after year. No risk, no losses, just profits. Or so they thought. Madoff's rise in the financial industry. By the 1970s, Bernie Madoff had already positioned himself as a rising star on Wall Street. While many traders relied on traditional paper-based stock trading, Madoff saw the future. Computers. At a time when most firms still executed trades manually, his company was among the first to embrace electronic trading systems. This gave him an edge. He could execute trades faster and more efficiently than competitors. But Madoff wasn't just another Wall Street trader. He was an innovator. He played a critical role in the formation of NASDAQ, National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotations, the world's first electronic stock exchange. It was a radical shift, away from the old system of shouting brokers and handwritten orders, and it changed everything. In 1971, NASDAQ was officially launched, offering an alternative to the New York Stock Exchange. It was designed to be faster, more efficient, and more accessible to smaller firms. Madoff was one of its earliest supporters and played a key role in shaping its operations. He recognized that electronic trading was the future, and he leveraged it to build his firm into a powerhouse. By the 1980s, Madoff's company had grown beyond just a small trading operation. It became one of the largest market makers in the industry. So, what exactly is a market maker? Think of them as the behind-the-scenes facilitators of smooth stock trading. A market maker is a firm that facilitates stock trading by buying and selling securities to ensure smooth transactions. Instead of waiting for buyers and sellers to find each other, market makers step in, reducing delays and keeping the market liquid. Madoff's firm excelled at this. He processed trades for some of the biggest retail brokers and investment firms in the country. His company became a go-to partner for executing large trades efficiently because his firm was so deeply embedded in the financial system. It meant that thousands of transactions worth billions of dollars flowed through Madoff's operation every day. By the 1990s, Madoff wasn't just an important player in finance, he was a leader. His firm was seen as a model of efficiency, reliability, and stability. It had top-tier technology, a prestigious client list, and a reputation for delivering results. That reputation earned him an even bigger role at NASDAQ. In 1990, Madoff became vice chairman of NASDAQ, further solidifying his influence. Unlike many traders who sought attention, Madoff maintained an image of calm professionalism. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make reckless bets. He presented himself as a careful, conservative investor who valued trust above all else, and people believed him. His firm's ability to handle high-profile clients with discretion gave it an air of exclusivity. Investors saw it as a privilege to have access to Madoff's expertise. Many believed that Madoff's success came from his deep industry connections, superior technology, and strategic insight. Few questioned whether there was more to the story, but there was more to the story. Behind the polished image and Wall Street accolades, something far more sinister was brewing, something that would shake the entire financial world to its core. The evolution of the Ponzi scheme. How Madoff perfected the illusion. For decades, Bernie Madoff's brokerage firm was a respected institution, handling billions in trades and shaping the modern financial market. But behind the scenes, there was another operation, a secretive investment advisory business that no one questioned. This wasn't just another hedge fund. It was a financial illusion. Most people knew Bernie Madoff as the founder of a legitimate brokerage firm, one of the largest and most trusted market makers on Wall Street. It processed trades for major institutions and had a stellar reputation. But Madoff also ran an entirely separate business, his investment advisory division. Unlike his brokerage firm, this operation was highly secretive. There was no trading floor, no complex financial algorithms, and no actual investments. Instead, it was something much simpler, a Ponzi scheme. How the scheme worked. Madoff lured wealthy investors and institutions with an irresistible promise, steady market-beating returns of 10 to 12% annually, regardless of market conditions. His so-called strategy? A split-strike conversion. According to Madoff, he used a combination of buying stocks in major companies, hedging with options to limit risk, holding a portion in treasury bills for stability. It sounded sophisticated, something only a financial genius could master. But in reality, none of it was real. Instead of investing client funds, Madoff was simply using new investors' money to pay older investors, a classic Ponzi scheme. Here's why it worked for so long. Most Ponzi schemes collapse quickly because they rely on an ever-growing supply of new investors. But Madoff designed his differently. making it seem far more legitimate than past frauds. Madoff didn't just run a Ponzi scheme, he perfected it. His strategy was far more sophisticated than the typical con. It wasn't just about fake numbers, it was about psychology. Rather than relying solely on fabricated data, Madoff played a more subtle game. Here's how he lured the world's wealthiest individuals and institutions. Madoff knew that the easiest people to scam were those who already trusted him. So instead of targeting random investors, he went after communities that shared deep social bonds. The Jewish community, where he was a respected philanthropist, country clubs, and elite financial circles, where word of mouth spread his reputation. Even charitable foundations saw him as a safe and reliable steward of their funds. His victims didn't just invest because of his returns, they invested because of his connections. Madoff's biggest advantage? He wasn't working alone. Instead of dealing with individual investors, he used hedge funds and financial intermediaries to funnel billions into his scheme. These feeder funds, run by prestigious firms, unknowingly legitimized Madoff's fraud. If a respected hedge fund trusted him, why would anyone question it? Madoff didn't ask for money. He turned people away. When someone expressed interest in investing, he would politely refuse, only to later allow select individuals in. This made his fund seem like an elite, invitation-only opportunity. Potential investors weren't just eager to give him their money. They felt privileged to do so. Every month, Madoff's investors received official-looking statements showing steady, impressive profits. The only problem? None of it was real. His firm never actually traded securities, but the fake reports made it seem like they did. Bogus stock purchases, perfectly timed options trades, consistent, market-defying profits. It all looked legitimate, so no one questioned it. For years, Madoff's scheme ran without a hitch. Investors believed they were making steady profits, and withdrawals were processed without delay. But there was one simple truth. Madoff's profits existed only on paper. The moment too many investors tried to cash out at once, the entire empire would crumble. And in 2008, that's exactly what happened. For nearly 2 decades, Bernie Madoff had built an empire on lies. But no Ponzi scheme lasts forever. In 2008, the illusion finally shattered. The global financial crisis of 2008 sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Investors panicked. Banks failed. Trust in the system collapsed. Madoff's clients, many of the wealthy individuals and institutions, wanted their money back. The requests started small. Millions here, millions there, then billions. But there was one problem. The money didn't exist. Madoff had never actually invested those billions. It was all smoke and mirrors. And now, for the first time, he couldn't cover the withdrawals. On December 10th, 2008, Bernie Madoff admitted to his 2 sons that his entire investment business was a lie. His sons alerted the federal authorities about his fraud. New York, December 11th, 2008. The FBI enters the penthouse of one of the world's most highly respected financiers. Bernie Madoff, once celebrated as a financial genius, now stood accused of running the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. His arrest made headlines worldwide. News stations rushed to cover the story. But the most shocking part wasn't just the scale of the fraud. It was the fact that, even as the financial system crumbled, Madoff's victims still believed their money was safe. Madoff wouldn't scam us. So they say. Even as banks failed and financial institutions crumbled, Madoff's clients insisted, "Bernie has our money. We'll get it back. He's too smart to lose." They had no idea their life savings were already gone. Throughout history, financial scams have come and gone. But Madoff's Ponzi scheme was different. It wasn't run by an unknown fraudster. It didn't target reckless gamblers. It wasn't built on greed. It was built on trust. Madoff wasn't born into Wall Street privilege, unlike the typical finance elite, who came from wealthy families and attended Ivy League schools. Madoff carved his path. He built his reputation. He earned people's trust. And then, he used it against them. Harvard professor Eugene Soltis, who spent years studying white-collar criminals, noted something unique about Madoff's crime. Unlike many fraudsters, Madoff knew his victims personally. These were family. These were friends, members of his community. And yet, he stole from them, without hesitation. Madoff's downfall didn't happen in a vacuum. It came at the worst possible moment, right after the largest bankruptcy in Wall Street history. The failure of Lehman Brothers had already shaken global markets. Madoff's arrest was the final devastating blow to investor confidence. The next day, he was released on bail, but the damage was done. Thousands of investors were ruined overnight. The financial world was in shock, and outside Madoff's apartment, angry victims and hungry journalists gathered, demanding answers. But the full story of Madoff's betrayal was only just beginning. When news of Madoff's arrest broke, shock turned to fury. It was a tornado, a hurricane, and a tsunami. The world had just learned that the man once seen as a financial icon had orchestrated one of the most devastating frauds in history. Madoff stepped outside his Manhattan penthouse, only to be swarmed by the media. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes blinded him, and microphones were shoved in his face. The crowd outside wasn't just watching. They were waiting for vengeance. "Bernie, it's not too late, jump." Some signs compared him to the Joker, the chaotic villain from Batman. He had gone from a respected financier to public enemy number one. The damage was unimaginable. Madoff's victims weren't just rich hedge fund managers. They were everyday people, retirees who had lost everything. Families suddenly faced foreclosure. Charities that had collapsed overnight. Helen Chapman, an attorney representing over 300 of Madoff's victims, had been one of them. It was like watching the Twin Towers fall. You just couldn't believe it. She had spent years building her savings, and in an instant, it was gone. We have people in our group who don't know where they'll be living in 3 months. I want him to go into a jail cell, and I want him to sit there. And you know what? He shouldn't be sitting with his Apple computer, and he shouldn't be sitting in his $7 million penthouse apartment. To understand how Madoff fooled the world's smartest investors, we have to go inside his mind. His operation ran from the iconic Lipstick Building on 3rd Avenue. From this office, for over 20 years, he executed one of the most elaborate financial illusions ever conceived. Tens of thousands of victims, billions of dollars vanished, regulators completely fooled. And yet through it all, he never broke a sweat. More than 10% returns in finance wasn't just impressive, it was suspicious. Some fund managers had sensed something was off. In 2005, one such manager met with Madoff. Inside his lavish office, he noticed something odd, a sculpture of a screw. Curious, he asked, "Why a screw?" Madoff smirked. "You know that screw is another word for the F word. And it's a screw because that's what I do. I screw people." He knew. He didn't care. He was a crook. Despite his arrest on December 11th, 2008, Bernard Madoff wasn't immediately thrown into a cell. Instead, He was granted bail, allowed to return to his $7 million Manhattan penthouse. For the victims who had lost everything, it was an insult. While retirees scrambled to pay rent and charities shut their doors, Madoff remained in his high-rise, surrounded by luxury. But his world was shrinking. He wore an electronic ankle bracelet, a silent reminder that his days of freedom were numbered. Outside, the fury grew. Protesters lined the streets, waving signs and chanting for justice. Reporters camped outside, waiting for any glimpse of the man who had shattered thousands of lives. For 3 months, Madoff lived in a bubble of wealth, but he could not escape the storm closing in. March 12, 2009. Madoff stood in court and pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies: securities fraud, money laundering, perjury, and more. The air was thick with tension. Victims filled the courtroom, some in tears, others shaking with rage. Bernard Madoff, once the king of Wall Street, now stood as a disgraced criminal. Since the scandal broke in early December, he made his first public comment about his crimes. After pleading guilty, he said, "I am actually grateful for this opportunity to publicly comment about my crimes, for which I am deeply sorry and ashamed." Madoff, speaking softly but firmly, he told the judge the scheme began in the early 1990s, when the country was in a recession and the market was not doing well. He said he accepted investors' money, but didn't put it into the market. Instead, he sent them phony account statements showing that they were making money. "When I began the Ponzi scheme, I believed it would end shortly, and I would be able to extricate myself and my clients from the scheme," he said. However, this proved difficult and ultimately impossible. And as the years went by, I realized that my arrest and this day would inevitably come. Madoff confessed to his family that he had committed a $50 billion fraud. However, prosecutors estimated the amount at $64.8 billion in court documents. His decades-long deception had cost investors an estimated $65 billion, the largest Ponzi scheme in history. Helicopters circled above the courthouse before the hearing, and federal officers with automatic weapons stood outside as Madoff arrived. Investors signed in before entering the 24th floor courtroom. Richard and Cynthia Friedman came to get a glimpse of the man who defrauded them of their life savings of $3 million. Richard Friedman, an accountant, noticed how well his clients were doing with Madoff and began investing his own money in 1991. He learned it was gone months before he had planned to retire, a plan now on hold. "I wanted him to see some of the faces of the people he lied to and destroyed," said Cynthia Friedman. June 29th, 2009. The courtroom was silent as Judge Denny Chin delivered the sentence. 150 years in prison and an order to pay restitution of $170 billion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some victims clutched one another, others nodded in satisfaction. Madoff showed little emotion. "It is the judgment of this court," the judge declared, "that Bernard L. Madoff shall spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no parole, no second chances. Madoff would die behind bars." The government worked to recover stolen funds, liquidating Madoff's assets, his penthouse, his yachts, his jewelry. But for many victims, it was too late. Their savings were gone, and their retirement plans were destroyed. "Justice was served," one victim later said, "but it didn't bring back what we lost." Madoff spent his final years at Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina. The man who once controlled billions now lived in a small gray cell, stripped of power, fortune, and reputation. On April 14th, 2021, At the age of 82, Bernard Madoff died in prison from chronic kidney disease. There was no grand farewell, no mourning crowds, just the quiet end of a man who had once deceived the world. The fallout from Madoff's Ponzi scheme was unlike anything the financial world had ever seen. Thousands of investors, rich and poor alike, lost everything. Some had trusted Madoff with their retirement funds. Others had invested their entire family fortunes. Even elite institutions, universities and charities were caught in the web of deception. Celebrities and the wealthy were not spared. Famous names were among the victims. Director Steven Spielberg, actor John Malkovich, and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel all suffered losses. Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and humanitarian, called Madoff one of the greatest scoundrels in history. His foundation lost $15.2 million, wiped out overnight. For some, the loss was unbearable. René Thierry Magon de la Ville-Huchet, a French aristocrat and investment manager, had placed his clients and his own money in Madoff's fund. When the truth came out, he couldn't live with the shame. Just days after the scandal broke, he was found dead in his office, an apparent suicide. The aftermath of the fraud case made Mark, one of Madoff's sons, commit suicide at age 46 in December 2010 by hanging himself with a dog leash in his Manhattan apartment. Another victim, William Foxton, a decorated British soldier, took his own life after losing his life savings. Madoff's fraud was initially estimated at $65 billion, but forensic accountants later determined that the actual money lost and net cash invested were between $10 billion and $17 billion. The rest was imaginary profits, numbers Madoff had fabricated over decades. In the years that followed, court-appointed trustee Irving Picard led efforts to recover stolen funds. By 2020, roughly $14 billion had been returned to victims, an unprecedented amount for a Ponzi scheme. But for many, the damage was irreversible. As one victim put it, "You can get some of the money back, but you can never get back the years, the peace of mind, or the trust that was stolen." For years, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the agency meant to prevent fraud, failed to stop Madoff. Despite multiple investigations, they never uncovered his Ponzi scheme. Why? Madoff played the system perfectly. Madoff wasn't just another Wall Street executive. He was a respected industry leader. He advised the SEC on financial matters, making him seem untouchable. When regulators came knocking, he gave them just enough information to satisfy them, but never enough to expose his fraud. Fake trading records, fabricated, audits, manipulated, investigations, dismissed as routine checks. One former investigator admitted, Madoff was seen as a financial genius. Nobody wanted to believe he was lying. Not everyone was fooled. Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst, saw the red flags early. In 2000, 2001, and 2005, he filed detailed reports to the SEC, proving mathematically that Madoff's returns were impossible. It was the easiest case of fraud I'd ever seen, Markopoulos later said. Yet, his warnings were ignored. By the time Madoff was caught, billions were gone. Investors, charities, and pension funds had been wiped out. The SEC later admitted its failure, with one official stating, "We missed what should have been an obvious case." It wasn't just a lapse in oversight. It was one of the biggest regulatory failures in financial history. The collapse of Madoff's empire left thousands financially shattered. But was there any hope of recovering their money? In 2013, the Madoff Victim Fund, MVF, was established to return stolen money to defrauded investors. $4 billion has been distributed so far, providing some relief to those who lost everything. The fund was sourced from government settlements with banks and firms that had unknowingly handled Madoff's fraudulent transactions. The Madoff Recovery Initiative, hunting down hidden wealth. Led by court-appointed trustee Irving Picard, the Madoff Recovery Initiative went after banks, feeder funds, and individuals who had profited from the Ponzi scheme. Lawsuits were filed against wealthy investors, some of whom had unknowingly benefited from Madoff's fraud. By 2020, Picard had recovered nearly $14 billion, one of the largest clawbacks in financial history. The scandal also led to stricter financial regulations, including enhanced SEC scrutiny and investor protection measures. Bernie Madoff didn't just steal money, he stole futures, dreams, and trust. His scheme wasn't built on numbers, but on deception so masterful that even the sharpest minds on Wall Street fell for it. The collapse of his empire wasn't just a financial scandal, it was a reckoning. The SEC failed, the banks looked away, the investors believed, and in the end, thousands of lives were ruined, while Madoff lived in luxury until his final moment behind bars. But here's the real lesson. This can happen again. Madoff may be gone, but greed and blind trust still fuel the financial world. There will always be another too-good-to-be-true opportunity, another smooth-talking fraudster, another promise of wealth that ends in devastation. So the question is, will you see the red flags before it's too late? If you enjoyed this look back at the biggest financial crime in history, make sure to subscribe for more insights into the world of money, power, and deception. Until next time, stay informed and stay cautious. And of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.